Hey everyone, and welcome to another session of Ramble and Mosey, where we talk about critical issues in conservation and outdoor recreation, celebrating the people and places that make Michigan so special. We hope you're as inspired by these sessions as we are. A couple of really special guests today. Megan Moto, founder of Parallel Solutions, is our co-host, and she needs little introduction. Also joining us is Zachary Branigan, the executive director for the Saginaw Basin Land Conservancy. Super passionate about the outdoors. Zachary grew up in the Saginaw Bay watershed and is an experienced mountain biker, photographer, trail runner, birder, naturalist, father, husband, and all-around good dude. Zachary's unique background in community development and fine art have allowed him to approach conservation in new ways, and we look forward to digging into things with him. Well, Zachary, long list of stuff that you're involved in, both professionally and personally. What's new these days? What are you up to?
Well, professionally, we're extremely busy at the Land Conservancy with a couple of new projects that have continued to grow. One of them is that over the last year, we've really taken on the issue of urban canopy and tree restoration because the communities that we serve primarily are deeply underserved uh, by trees, by tree canopy, and so there's a pretty serious tree inequity issue in both Bay City and Saginaw, our immediate communities there. We adopted a new strategic plan recently. We're working on our strategic conservation plan right now. So there's that. A couple new interesting land protection projects, continuing with some of our blight remediation work in Saginaw, and just trying to gear up and staff up for the coming year. So that's what's going on there. And personally, just trying to get outside, do some traveling, uh, you know, those sorts of things.
And remind me, I should know this. You've been at the Conservancy now how long?
Well, I'm just starting my 13th year, so I had my 12-year anniversary just a little while ago.
Oh, congratulations! Right on. It was
Thanks.
a that was a pretty big transformation too, right? I mean, there was a good traditional land conservation going on, lots of use of conservation easements.
Mhm.
What did it feel like, sort of stepping in and then wanting to take on bigger?
Sure. Well, when I came into the Land Conservancy, it was in a sort of a precarious position. So it was a land trust with a huge portfolio and very little resources. So they had been coming off a 7 or 8 year long program where they had been working with basically the federal government, a variety of different funding sources to convert temporary CREP easements into permanent conservation easements. And so they had accumulated a considerable number of acres. We had 5,500 acres or something under conservation. When I stepped in, we're about 6,000 now, which makes us, a reasonably good sized land trust. But I was the only permanent employee when I took the job, and resources were few and far between. So the biggest thing was to try to establish relevance and to try to raise the profile of the Land Conservancy to build a base of support to make sure that we could at least, at a very, very minimum standard, take care of the land that we already had under conservation. And everything kind of grew from there. But I was coming off a career as an urban planner for about 12 years prior to that, and I did my graduate studies in Ann Arbor for urban planning. And after a series of life changes in that, my wife and I decided to move up here when I had the opportunity to take this job. So I really didn't know how to do it. I think there was a relatively shallow bench of people that applied for the job, so I got it, and here I am. But I took it on the only way I knew how, which was try to reach out and build consensus over what the land trust should be to the communities that it served. And as it turned out, in those first couple of years, I realized pretty quickly that um, there were issues that were sort of tangential to and adjacent to the traditional things a land trust does, but not squarely in the sights of what most land trusts do. So that kind of led us into some of the things you had mentioned, kind of in the intro there about some of the urban projects. That's kind of where it came from because it was really trying to connect, people and nature and the communities we worked in.
I think if we often joke about this, but you sort of reference like the steep learning curve. I think if anybody
Yeah.
tells you that they know what it means to be an executive director, and certainly of a land conservancy, they're probably lying to you. But
Oh yeah. Yeah, I mean, I've been trotting that joke out for a long time. Ever since I got this job, I always tell people that, as a land use planner who had done a lot of environmental policy work, I thought for sure, hey, this would be a great fit for me because there's obviously tons of overlap. I dealt with land trusts and land banks and that in my old career. And then, of course, come to find out, a couple of years into my career here, I realized there was really virtually no overlap and I had no idea what I was doing. But I guess I snowed enough people to allow me to keep the job. But Honestly, I tell people all the time. I mean, I don't necessarily think that our industry needs, specific training. I think that it's a good industry for creative, well-rounded people who just want to, continue to learn and innovate and take on really challenging projects. So I look for problem solvers. So of my 5 permanent staff, 4 of us have art degrees, because I always tell people hire art majors because they're creative, they're great problem solvers. They love to see solutions, and usually they need a job. So that's where that comes from.
Yeah, it's the what's the old saying on the T-shirt? I have a liberal arts degree. Would you like fries with that? So
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, that's more or less it. Yeah, yeah,
Meg and I were talking about that earlier too, though. The entrepreneurial spirit and the innovative spirit really seems to be what's driving Land Conservancy leadership, and that's certainly exemplified at the SBLC.
yeah. Thanks. I mean, our first need was that we needed to staff up in order to make sure that we could continue to do the job, right? And so, how do you do that when nobody knows who you are and you're in a community that doesn't necessarily have the deep philanthropic resources that you do in, some of the more wealthy communities? I mean, we're in a pretty, um, little beat up part of the state, in a lot of ways, and so we're underdogs. So I thought, one of the best ways for us to grow was to earn it. And that's how I grew up. I grew up in a small business background. My parents owned a lumber yard when I was growing up. And the only way that I knew how to, dig myself out of a hole was to, get odd jobs, mow lawns, things like that. I just was like, we can do that. There's time for that stuff. So we started to seek out stewardship assistance opportunities. And that's really been, about 60% of our revenue now comes from earned income from things that we do for the communities that we serve. So, we do all sorts of projects for City of Bay City, Saginaw County Land Bank, City of Saginaw, Saginaw County is another one, Bay County, and then lots of little communities too. So we'll do a variety of different projects for them, or, give them an assist on something that they're already working on. And now, because we've grown over these last dozen years or so, we're in a position where we can generate the grants that are going to pay for all the direct costs too. So, we've been able to come to communities and say, hey, this is a problem that needs solving, sort of push them into that position. And it's pretty easy to take an advocacy position when you can say, hey, and by the way, I know these guys will pay for it, and I've got people to pay me to do the work for you. So all you have to do is nod your head and agree and stay out of our way, and we can do this thing that the community needs. And that's kind of been, um, a benchmark of our growth over the last, 7, 8 years, especially. So we've been able to do a lot of work, but also we've been able to grow the Land Conservancy and build permanent capacity and build a backlog of resources and make sure that we're kind of set up for the next generation. On top of that, we've got now a full fleet of basically landscaping rigs with trucks. We took delivery of a bobcat the other day, which is a pretty big purchase for a small land trust. So yeah, so it's a good thing.
I'm wondering, Zachary, if you can talk about the strategic shift
Hmm.
in the way you've directed resources and programs that are still in line with your conservation mission, but are different than some of the other approaches land trusts typically take. So when you started and things started to change, what were the conversations like at the board level about where you were going to focus your energy and time and resources, and how has that evolved since over the past few years since you've been there?
Well, initially when I talked to the board that had hired me, they were to their credit, they were pretty open minded because they were feeling the pinch of whether or not they were going to be there the next year. I mean, it was worse than I thought when I took the job, and that was to no one's. That's not an indictment on anybody on the board. It was just that I don't think they knew how tough it actually was going to be for me when I came into that position. My predecessor left, and they had concluded this long federal program and taken on all this responsibility, and really didn't have a good pathway, out of the wilderness, so to speak, to figure out how to make it happen. So um, they were very open minded right off the bat. And then also, I would say that nothing convinces people more that you're in the right direction than success does. So, there's a few small wins that I got right away to kind of show them how this model would work. But it was all built on the only thing I knew how to do, which was to build consensus and listen to the community. I mean, as a trained urban planner, the everything is public hearings and meetings and one-on-ones and sitting across from developers and battling it out and rewriting ordinances and planning. So I had inherited some strategic planning that wasn't terribly, in line with what I thought needed to happen. And so we tackled that. That was a little bit of a wrestling match. There was a few members that, when their terms completed, they said like, yeah, I get it. It's maybe not quite for me, and so that was a good thing because it allowed me to then start building a board around the philosophies that we had in mind and the remaining members had in mind. And then it just kind of continued to evolve. But I mean, the number one thing is that there was a few of our supporters that really believed in some of the ideas we had right off the bat. And we started doing a couple of minor urban conservation projects. The Bay Area Community Foundation came in pretty big and gave us, at the time, their largest single grant they had ever given, which was $100,000 all at one go to do a project in Bay City that we called Outdoor Urban Recreation, which is the OUR Bay City project. And that included renovating a county park, which has now still been in our care now in its 11th or 12th year. We call it Discovery Preserve. It had the very charming name of Euclid Linear Park before that, and it was a really rough place. And now it's got a playground and all kinds of stuff, a nature-based playground. We did remediated some issues on a vacant piece of property on the middle grounds in an island in the middle of the Saginaw River here in town. And that's called Michigan Sugar Trails now, which we actually just are in the process of signing a new agreement and going to get a substantial new funding injection from Michigan Sugar themselves to continue to improve that site. So that's going on 10 years later. A couple other small projects, but the thing was, we were just kind of developing a foothold on this idea that we could go and fix up a piece of land because we were developing that capability, even if we didn't have a long-term protection objective for that land. Because at the end of the day, the main thing that I was able to convince the board of was, yes, land protection is, of course, obviously central to what we do. It's amazing. We're protecting it forever and all that. But there's a lot of land trusts that protect a lot of land but don't take very good care of it either. And so, in my mind, I thought, well, what about taking care of land, especially land that's in the public trust, like a city or a county park, but, some of these other public-private partnerships too. So it was incremental. But then the next big thing was, after doing a few of these relatively smaller projects, we wanted to kind of march into Saginaw, which is a much bigger community with, almost inarguably much more complex problems, and certainly land use problems that are, far outpacing the land use problems we have in Bay County. And so, thankfully, the Watershed Initiative Network and Mike Kelly were early buy-in believers to a method that I had put out there about consensus building over a course of a year, kind of an active listening process that we called Taking Root in Saginaw at the time. And we continued that model and have done it in other places as well. And we've helped the National Wildlife Refuge, and now we're in the process of working with Consumers Energy to talk about future land uses of their site here in Bay County. So it's been a model that we've done to sort of curate audiences and focus groups to talk about some of these problems. So that's honestly where a lot of it came from. That's a long-winded answer, but the issue was the land trust didn't really know what the major issues facing the community were from an environmental perspective or a land use perspective inside the city limits or in the populated areas of our watershed. And so I just said, well, we have to create a situation where we can go out and listen to what people have to say, and then we'll try to respond to that. And it was a very successful model because by the time the Saginaw Bay Watershed Initiative Network funded project, the Taking Root in Saginaw was done, we had included the philanthropic community in that whole conversation, and all of the projects we recommended proceeding with, by the time we were able to publish the document, they were all fully funded before we were even able to publish the report. So it was a success, and everything has kind of expanded from there.
Zachary, they're following from a distance some of those projects and also the Taking Root effort itself as a listening component. Are there things that you would recommend others do, and are there things that you'd recommend others avoid at all cost, like in terms of your learning from that process?
Oh yeah, I mean, yeah. Anybody, how long is this podcast? Because there's definitely an awful lot of mistakes made along the way, and now, we're happy to help just about anybody with just about anything because we had to make all those mistakes first. Somebody had to, but I think Probably the number one thing that I would say is, be careful not to overestimate the capacity of your partners or their willingness to kind of be in it for the long term. We in our industry have this mentality of being here forever, and that's one of our, that's the hallmark of being a land trust, right? That's what makes us different than every other kind of nonprofit. Municipalities, you would think they should think that way, but it's not always that way because you have, elected bodies that come and go, and you have staff members that come and go, and they might not get it. So, continuing to reinforce that communication and that viability of the project with your partners is important. And we do that by revisiting and continuing to improve those projects all the time. So, it'll be, a couple years later and I'll say, well, wouldn't it be nice if we had this at this site? And it's a way to re-engage those partners and keep it up. Some communities are tougher than others to work in, like the very resource compromised communities, they hand it off to you, sometimes. So be careful not to take on too much. Be careful not to take on. This is the number one criticism I get when, like, I'm at a Land Trust Alliance thing or something, and somebody asks a question. Well, how is that sustainable? Well, you know, it's sustainable in that we have a significant donor base now, and the land trust is going to continue to be here, and we make sure the portfolio of work that we take on doesn't, outpace our capacity to do so. And then consider that. So, right now, for instance, we've gotten some pressure from, a few folks to look at this conservation project or restore that. You should buy that, add that nature preserve. But, we have another one very close by that's a project we're working on that's much more significant in scale. I can't take on both of them. So it's about making choices and making sure that you understand really not only what you're taking on during the process of doing that project, but also what the legacy of that project will be. We do that with contracts and agreements with the communities that we serve. So some of the projects that we have done, Riverbend West is a good example. When you go by there, Discovery Preserve is another one. It looks and breathes like an SPLC nature preserve, but we don't own either of those properties. But we've got a long-term agreement where we share responsibility for its care with the community. Our part in those is not so significant that we wouldn't be able to manage it even alongside our other things. We leave it where hardscape stuff is guaranteed by and maintained by the municipality. And, the vegetation, the signage, the interpretation, that kind of stuff is our responsibility. So it's just trying to be clever about what you think you can actually do and just growing incrementally, not growing too fast. That's another thing that's, generally speaking, from an operations perspective, is something that I, took on very early, which is just to grow incrementally and carefully. So I'm always looking for people that when they come to work for us, they're willing to work hard and they get rewarded for it. We provided a lot of benefits. We provide, I think, above standard compensation for the jobs that we offer. But, I expect a lot from the people that I work with because I would rather reward those people, build longevity in my staff, and that rather than burn people out and by not paying them enough and having people coming in all the time. So, yeah, having a high capacity staff and understanding, what your responsibilities are and just being careful as you grow.
Something I'm curious about is just how you measure success at this stage in your organization. A lot of land trusts will focus on measurements like how many acres of land have been protected or how much money have we raised. I'm curious what measurements you're using.
Well, problem solved is kind of one, I would say. Like if if we go out, and we build consensus in a community that, you know, there's an acute point of stress, in that this particular area in Saginaw, for instance, has widespread illegal dumping, tremendous amount of blight, lots of vacant area, and that this is what happened, 8 years ago when we first came in. The number one thing we heard from everybody was land conservation, huh? Why don't you maybe focus on all the vacant land that's already out there? That's the number one problem in Saginaw, especially on the east side behind historical red lines. And in these neighborhoods, we've got, 60, 70% vacancy in some of these neighborhoods. How do you measure success? Well, we build projects that are trying to incrementally solve those problems. And then we kind of say, well, what percentage of, this problem have we turned the tide on, I should say. We use a project dashboard internally where we literally assign, estimated percentages of effort for every task in the project. And then as we complete those, we'll say, well, it's 50% complete. And that was 20% of the project. So then that gives us an indication of this much percentage of that project is complete. But, that's getting down in the weeds. I mean, really, it's more along the lines of, it's, it, a lot of land trusts wouldn't like this answer, but to a certain degree, it's a gut feeling. It's just like, hey, this neighborhood looks better than when we started here. This area is safer than when we started here statistically. We know from the Saginaw police that these areas where we've done this work there, that there are less occurrences of violent crime in these neighborhoods. There's things like that we can measure that are highly unusual for a land trust to use. I would say acres protected is probably like seventh or eighth on the list for us. We don't aggressively add acres. We have added acres essentially every year that I've been here. We just had a recent incredible legacy gift made to us just in the last few weeks, and we did a couple conservation easements last year, and we've done that. But a lot of the acres that we have restored are not permanently protected by us, but they are acres that are now open to the public because of the work that we've done, because there was a problem on those sites. So I'll tell you this, you might have heard me, Megan, in our previous conversations, working on planning documents and stuff, that our initial thought with a potential project is it difficult? Is it worth doing? And would it happen without us? And that's just like a 3-question mantra that I ask almost daily, in the building. And if it's difficult, then it's probably a project for us. We're not going to do too many easy projects because there's a lot of potential projects out there. Somebody else can do it. If it's easy, okay, well, maybe we find somebody else that can give a hand with it, or we're a tipping point partner to provide resources to somebody else. We've done that with like First Word Community Center. There's some smaller projects in that neck of the woods that we've come up against. We're like, hey, if we buy them a lawnmower and give them a little bit of training, they can take care of that themselves. But is it difficult? Okay, it's a hard project. Maybe a team like ours could tackle this, or at least come up with a solution. Is it worth doing? Well, there's a lot of different ways to measure that, but when I think. And then would it happen without us is the last one, because there's a lot of projects that are worth doing and they're going to be difficult. But there are other people working on those, and we don't necessarily want to horn in. And that came from our, kind of knowledge building in Saginaw, because there were a lot of well-meaning groups out there that have been struggling with projects forever. And once we got involved, it happened, or we were a tipping point partner, where we were able to come in and say, hey, if the number one thing that you're dealing with is X, we can tackle that particular issue, which is going to break the dam for you to kind of get through and finish the rest of this. But even the large projects we take on as the primary on them, they all got to kind of go through that filter, among many others. So that's how we, kind of determine where we're going to be, and then identify all those little metrics along the way.
As the data nerd in the bunch, actually, we're all data nerds. Who am I kidding? But as one of the self-proclaimed data nerds of the bunch, as we track the metrics annually on the kind of amount of land that are protected by Michigan's land conservancies, the traditional tools of fee simple acquisitions and conservation easements, those are still rising, but certainly not at the rate or the pace that the bucket that we refer to as transfers and assists, which are essentially the kinds of stewardship agreements and assist work that you're doing. So really seeing, I think led by the SBLC and others early on, but really seeing a transition to, okay, there's a number of different ways to protect land. And just because it doesn't look like the traditional way that we did it doesn't mean that we're not protecting land as well. Even some of our friends refer to it as sort of this to protect, to enhance, restore, and sometimes protect land. That there's multiple ways to get to that long-term action.
I definitely agree with that. I mean, some of my colleagues in this industry that don't think what we do, really aligns with what they think our industry should be doing. I understand that. There's still sort of, some of that traditional mindset. And, a lot of it usually comes down to the environment they're working in. If you're working in Metro Detroit, during a phase of economic prosperity, then you're going to be thinking about land protection, to, urban sprawl might be one of the major issues that you're trying to combat, making sure that we're, leaving something for nature. We're leaving something for access to the outdoors. We're thinking about wildlife corridors, all the traditional things that a land trust might think about. But where we are, it's the opposite. We're dealing with disinvestment and vacancy most of the time. And so, what do you do with the surplus of this land? So it's I mean, even just from like a basic business perspective, it's tough to make the case to a philanthropy that's being pressured hard to solve, very immediate social service issues, to say, hey, we need a bunch of money from you to protect some open space, right next to this community that has vast amounts of open space. Why don't we instead find a way to manage the open space that's already there in a way that it's actually productive? The pollinator project, which was kind of our original large scale effort in this, in this arena, was approaching the Saginaw County Land Bank and saying, hey, you've got 3,000 truly vacant lots inside the city limits of Saginaw, which, is about, it's a fraction of what they have in Flint. Saginaw is also a fraction of the size of Flint, and same thing in Detroit. It's a very, similar situation on a per acre basis as it is to those two other communities. But, they've got 5,000 or 6,000 lots in the city, 3,000 of which have no structures on them at all. And all 3,000 of them essentially were overgrown with 6 foot tall weeds. They weren't mowing them or maintaining them the way that even Genesee County is able to do, because the Saginaw County Land Bank just doesn't have that staffing and resources. So since we sort of took that on, more than half of them have been addressed by our team in terms of knocking back blight, killing off all the invasive stuff, removing all the woody vegetation, removing the cars and boats and bumpers and piles of shingles and, things that make me have to go buy a bobcat, to clean up those lots. And then once we're able to basically strip it back to bare dirt, we replace it all with a carpet of low growing pollinators, pollinator plants. So, that's going back to an earlier question you had about, learning curve and all that stuff. That was one, maybe something I definitely should mention, is that don't be afraid to admit your mistakes and come up with better solutions, because you are going to make mistakes. And, the pollinator project has got a really good little anecdote in it that I tell all the time, which is that in those first couple of years, my coworkers and I had a plant mix that we would use that was about 3-4 feet tall at full growth, and it was an incredible, wildlife meadow restoration mix. It grew like crazy, filled up the lot, masked some of the other issues that might be there, and provided tremendous pollinator benefits. So we're patting ourselves on the back, but the public reaction to those in the first year was very negative, because they basically said, you kind of forget the fact that not everybody that lives in the neighborhood is a botanist, and as soon as all that stuff grew up and we're kind of driving around saying, yeah, man, this looks great. And it did look much better. The neighbors would be like, yeah, thanks for like cleaning all that stuff up and getting rid of the bucket of, needles and the old rusty car that was on the corner. I said, but why did you just let all the weeds grow back? And they're like, well, those aren't really weeds. You got to understand that's, coneflower, buddy. It's really important to the bumblebees. But try telling that to people that they have no idea, about, exactly the complicated nature of what this is. And, well, when are you going to come back and mow? Well, we're not going to mow because you don't want to mow this sensitive habitat that we created. So we had to come up with something different, and we, kind of mea culpa that and went back to the community and said, all right, we're hearing you. One of the things that, particularly on the east side of Saginaw, that they appreciated the fact is we had reestablished and reconnected, high visibility through these neighborhoods, because that was what was contributing to a lot of the safety issues and crime, was lots of hiding places. So opening it back up like that was fantastic for a little while. Then everything would grow back in, and they say just another broken promise. So we switched to a mix that really nothing grows more than 18 inches tall, and it's supported by, I think there's 7 or 8 different fescue varieties in there. And if you're not familiar, fescue doesn't stand up tall; it starts to weep over. So you just don't get that, high, blocking vegetation anywhere. It doesn't look as much like weeds. It looks more like a, clover-filled, lush carpet of vegetation. And you can drive around the east side of Saginaw and the north side of Saginaw there, and you can find whole city blocks that are just growing with this really diverse mix. Also, it's proven to be much more resilient, and also we can tell the neighbors you can go ahead and mow it if you want to, and it's not going to hurt it, because it grows much faster and it fills in. So some of those neighbors, it's amazing. I think of the 1,500 and some lots that we've done so far, almost maybe 300 of them are being maintained by others now. And nobody really kind of knows who, but usually it's the next door neighbor, or it's a faith-based community, or somebody there that it's like, well, now that all that stuff's out of the way, we're just going to go ahead and rip all the way down this city block and mow it. So it's been a considerable improvement, but a lot of that came from us just realizing, hey, put the brakes on. We made a mistake. Let's tell the community we made a mistake, and let's try to correct it. So another little piece of advice for these more complicated projects is to listen and try but admit when you get it wrong and then try again.
Yeah, that's really smart advice. Really smart advice. We're all sort of smiling and laughing as you're talking. So I'm picturing you and Trevor Edmonds driving the
Hmm.
streets of Saginaw, patting each other for
Oh yeah.
tall meadows while being chased out of town simultaneously.
More or less, yeah. I mean, I remember the very first day that we did anything for the pollinator project. Literally, the very first day, this would have been about 9 years ago. We had the only piece of equipment that we had at the time was a walk behind DR brush mower, like the kind that you might buy if you've got a little bit of property, but not something that was commercial scale. And we had a beat up, you know 8-year-old pickup truck, and so we pulled up in the pickup truck. We get this thing off of there. Within the first like 10 minutes on the very first lot, I can tell you exactly where it is in Saginaw. The throttle cable broke on the thing, and I was like, I hope this isn't a sign of things to come. But it was like, so we spent the whole first day just trying to fix our piece of chintzy equipment that we had there. That doesn't happen now, but yeah, it was. We just absolutely looked like amateurs that first day. I mean, I can't tell you how amateurish, the operation was when we first started. And now when we show up, it's like with, you know, three newer trucks and big box trailers, hundreds of volunteers, $80,000, track loader and all that stuff. It's just, but it's not just buying stuff. It took us a decade to kind of learn to do that and come up with that. So yeah, it really was, a couple of rubes with a lot of optimism and a suitcase full of naivete that started those projects because we just do it
Well,
ourselves. That's the thing. We just do it ourselves. That's maybe another little, you know, tip or hint for a lot of the other land trusts out there is that you're not going to make an impact without setting the example and doing a lot of that work yourself. I mean, it's far more expensive to to hire that stuff out, let alone you try to hire a landscaping company or something, say, hey, we got 100 grand and I sure would like to hire you to go out and clean up all these vacant lots. They're not going to do it. They don't even have the right kind of equipment to do it. It's a very unique and unusual mix of things you have to do and an unusual mix and skill set, which takes me back to the hiring art majors thing. It's like, hey, do you want to just be a ragtag group of folks that go out there and work hard and figure out how to do this? Because that's really what a lot of urban conservation projects are like. There's nothing but surprises. There's nothing but curveballs. No two lots look the same. Every single time you get out there, it's going to be different. So you have to be adaptable, and you got to have a pretty diverse package of resources available to you to make sure that you continue to do the work. And we just learned that by making mistake after mistake and breaking throttle cables and planning the wrong things and all that stuff. So that's really kind of what it looked like. I mean, I look back now, I would have grabbed myself and said run, but here we are.
What does the future look like? I mean, you're talking about learning and adaptation. I'm curious as you look at the horizon for that partnership with the land banks. What
Sure.
does that look like for you?
Well, there's already been one evolution of it. I mean, we spent the first 5, 6 years really heavily tackling blighted vacant lots in several areas. Now, we had a big conversation about this just the other day at the office because, now that we've got a bigger staff, we got a staff of 5, we've got, GIS capability. We have a young woman that works full time for us. That's, she's a graduate student and works for us full time, and she's kind of a GIS and analytical whiz. And which was great for me because I started, my planning gears started, turning again. And I started thinking, well, what kind of impact are we actually having? I can tell you, with the pollinator project, I could tell you how many lots we did, how many acres we did, and all that. But the funny thing is, when you go out there, yes, it looks better, but I mean, those are in some of the least populated areas of town. So all of that effort went into areas where not as many actual people were impacted. So when we rewrote our master plan or did a master plan refresh, 5, 6 years ago, I fought really hard for our mission statement rewrite, which, is take action at the intersection of people and nature, elevate landscapes for the benefit of all, show leadership in conservation. That's our mission statement. And, when you take a look at that, it's like, okay, well, taking action at the intersection of people and nature, I think is a little bit unusual for a lot of land trusts because, again, that kind of throws the idea of, acres protected and all that out the window. What it says is that we're a people first, almost social services, environmental justice, social equity oriented organization, which we definitely are. The rest of the plan reads that way. It's like if there's two projects of relatively equal ecological benefit, but one of them is going to benefit people more directly, then that's the one we're going to do, because that is what our community told us they needed. Because we have a tremendous amount of disinvestment here. We have a huge number of people living below the poverty line, and land use issues are impacting those people's lives. So that's kind of where we go. Elevate landscapes for the benefit of all, grows on that. It's you're talking about, we were talking about DEI before DEI got really, really popular in the land trust movement, because we were thinking, well, we need to go into neighborhoods that are not conventionally served by our organization. And when we do a project, we need to think about the fact that everybody needs to have access to it. It needs to be equitable, and all of those things. And then the last one, show leadership and conservation, is a little bit of a wink and a nudge and an elbow to some of the stuff we're talking about right now, which is that we want other organizations to take the same, the same tack that we did. We want to try to push other organizations to be thinking about some of these, complicated, less sexy, and very expensive projects that we take on. So, I would say that that's kind of where I hang my hat in that area. I may have drifted a little bit from the question there, but you know,
No,
uh,
I think my one of my big takeaways from what you're talking about is, these are my words, that the deep work of community engagement, thinking about land protection and land conservation across the spectrum. It isn't a specialty track at a conference. It isn't what
yeah,
shows up in this year's 2-year work plan. It's a long march, and it's what shows up as a common thread amongst all the work, not just the kind of the soup du jour.
hmm
And I think your experience is really important for others to learn from in that sense, because it's not just the latest and greatest. It is the work itself.
Well, right, and Jonathan, you really hit it on the head, because kind of, yeah, finishing off what I had mentioned about having some of this analytical capability. We started looking a little bit more deeply. We recently got a grant to do an analysis of some of the tree restoration work we're doing. We need to kind of develop a bigger plan for that. So, Megan, you had asked, like, what does the future look like, right? So the evolution of the pollinator project was, once we tackled half of the truly vacant lots in the city of Saginaw, we had done so. We took on all the worst ones, the ones that were in the roughest shape and the roughest areas, and all the stuff that they had the most junk and the most abandoned vehicles and buildings and stuff. And the repeat illegal dumping for the first 4 or 5 years, we would have 100 volunteers out. We'd fill two 40-yard dumpsters, and we'd be really proud of ourselves that we took all that garbage out of the neighborhood, and honestly, a lot of it, out of the watershed, because these things were right by the Saginaw River. And then the next spring, you'd go back there, and it was just as bad or worse than it was the year before. These past couple of years have not been like that. There's a variety of different factors. Obviously the pandemic probably threw a wrench in the statistics, but um, it's kind of incredible where we've kind of, every spring we sort of get in the car and wince as we drive back to some of these areas we've worked on. And the last few years, it's been a breath of fresh air, because there hasn't been repeat illegal dumping in those areas, and that's because, I think, a number of things. One is, we've by 1,000% have increased awareness of the issue, with the municipality, with the county, with the neighbors themselves. There's a lot more signs and closed circuit cameras and things like that are keeping an eye on things. But also, we've done things to just deter illegal dumping, like jumping right on it when it happens is the number one. I think a lot of people would agree that the number one deterrence for vandalism is to just take care of it right away, and keep it nice. But the other thing is that we would block access to lots with rows of trees. That was the number one thing. And even bad guys seem to be averse to driving over a little tree that somebody took the time to plant. And so we started planting thousands of trees in those neighborhoods, just on the inside of the lot, outside of the right of way. Planted a couple rows of small trees. Well, it turns out trees are really expensive, and that's a very complicated project too. But since then, we've generated literally hundreds of thousands, probably, I guess, $500,000 in revenue so far, from our collection of grants to grow that project, which is called Better Branches, and it builds on the pollinator project. We love alliteration. We got Better Branches, pollinator project. Um,
Art majors, we got it.
yeah, art majors, exactly. Yeah, yeah. You should see the logo; it's fantastic. That's the crowning achievement. But we we've got funding now for another 3 or 4 years, and literally thousands of other trees, to the point where we've planted our own tree nurseries. We even have internally at our office our own significant hydroponic setup where we're doing clippings, and then we're propagating our own trees from our own trees, to try to basically create a self-sustaining tree engine that we run, because you can't just run. I mean, the tree prices have tripled. So, through the pandemic, we used to get bare rootstock trees for, 15, $20. Now we're paying as much as $70 for some of those same trees. So we're trying to grow them ourselves. So we've been able to get quite a few interesting and significant grants coming in to allow us to do that. And we're going to plant a pretty large tree nursery actually at the airport in Bay City this year, because we've got a long-term partnership with them. They got a lot of empty space. And I said, hey, can we put a couple thousand trees, here? So that's what we're going to do there. So we're going to continue to do that and plant trees all over Saginaw, which we've done, and in Bay City, and all over the place, honestly. So the thing was, Sydney started working on this study that's funded by, WIN, and working with the Mott Foundation and some other resources to say, hey, are we having the impact that we need? How many trees do we actually need to plant to reverse, or at least arrest, the decline in the tree canopy? So that's where we're at right now. And we're adding this additional angle of, I could go on about this, but it's like we're breaking the community down to the census block level. So that's where we're working, is census blocks and census block groups, and identifying which ones are the worst in terms of tree vacancy and tree inequity. But then, taking the level of saying, all right, well, what's the actual population of these, and what's the population density of these? Because there's a few census block groups in Saginaw that are like 4 square miles, but most of it is the General Motors plant. So it's like that doesn't have that immediate impact on people. So, the super short summary is that I said, well, we're going to take this study all the way down the road, and we're going to look at which areas in the community meet all of these criteria. What's our first priority? And the first priority will be, not only to do the work, but also for all the ecological reasons, but to prioritize the ones that are going to have the most impact on the most people in the shortest amount of time with the least amount of resources. So having the capability internally to do that homework has been huge. And then we can say, all right, well, once we kind of address that, then we can move on to the next thing. We can move on to the next thing until eventually you've addressed the entire issue. Because you can look at like City of Saginaw as a whole and say, well, boy, this community's only got about 20% tree canopy. It should have about 40. And that's really where it's at. However, there's some areas in town that have got 50 and 60% tree canopy, and there's really not much of an issue. But those are also the areas where socioeconomic conditions are much more positive. But then some of the areas where it's the worst and the statistics are the worst are either highly commercial or very, very vacant. So you could say, well, this is the worst census block group in town. This area right here, let's go and plant, one hell of a lot of trees in this area here. But it turns out, not that those community residents or the people that live in that area don't deserve the attention, but you might end up disproportionately putting all the resources of the project in an area where very few people actually live and benefit from it. So instead, it's like, well, maybe we can just go and help those neighbors and get trees on their lot and on their street, rather than looking at these whole neighborhoods, more generally speaking. So the one thing I would say that's going to really define the future of our work, especially with urban conservation, is a lot of homework, a lot of head scratching, a lot of analysis, things that we didn't do before we broke the throttle cable the first time we ran out and just started mowing lawns in Saginaw with no idea what we were doing. We're definitely a much more sophisticated organization 12 years down the road.
Zach, I know one of the things that you really focused early on was also thinking about your board composition, and you've got some unique methods for both recruiting and retaining board members. So I'm curious, if there's some lessons that you might want to share there, or even just some techniques that have worked really well for you.
Sure. I mean, the tried and true method of, sitting around a table scratching our heads over, does anybody know any rich people that might want to be on the board? That wasn't really working. I would say that our board, they contribute, generously to the organization, especially in terms of their time, their effort, and their brain power. And they do give generously. Some of them give financially generously as well, but that has never been a priority of ours. Our thing has been, we want people that are willing to be critical thinkers, that are willing to be very open-minded about what they thought this board membership or this organization was going to be. We want people that have some familiarity with what we're doing. and also people that are healthy skeptics, that, are going to push me to, ask the right questions or sit back and say, huh, I hadn't thought of that. And so I want people that are going to be engaged. That's the number one thing. And by focusing on that, we have a very engaged board. I've always heard I'm sure you guys have all heard the thing. It's like 1/3 of your board is going to be all in. 1/3 of your board is going to say, yeah, I'm proud of it. And I come to most of the meetings. And then 1/3 of it, they don't give a damn. They're there for work or something else. That's not like that on our board. I mean, to a person, I would say everybody that's on that board is there because they developed a relationship with us. They thought they could make a contribution. And we actually make them apply to the board. We don't recruit like ever. We might ask somebody to, consider it and say, but even then, we don't offer them a board spot. We don't say like, hey, Megan, you're sharp. I admire you. You've got a lot of experience in that. Have you ever thought about being a board member? Right? We'd love to invite you to be a part of our board. We would never do that. We would go so far as to say, I think that you would make a good applicant for our board. Like you might have a chance of getting in. If so that's kind of the way that we do it. We take in a year when we want to add board members, we have 16, I think right now, 17. Last year, we did not recruit any or take any applications because we had nobody leaving. All the existing members, we had, I think, 6 or 7 were actually up for renewal, and they all asked to be renewed. So our board development committee met and said they wanted to have all of them renew. And so they made that recommendation to the board. We reappointed them and decided not to bring any new members on. So there's a certain amount of I don't want to say exclusivity. That kind of sounds like we're patting ourselves on the back, but it's not a situation where anybody can walk in the door. We're very, very careful about who we have come in, and the application, it requires an essay. It's like write an essay, that tells us these following things about why you think you could help and what in particular, made you interested. We've had new board members come in that had not previously been volunteers or donors or anything. They had heard about us because of the recruitment process, or this open application process, and they came across it and they applied, and ultimately a few of them did get on, and they have since thrived as board members because it was an opportunity they had been looking for that they didn't even know existed. So, I would say that's probably the number one thing is just being really careful to vet people and being really okay with saying no. There's, somebody who was on our board, it took them a couple of tries to get on the board. They were politely declined a couple of times, but they were persistent. And in the interim, they had started volunteering and doing other things and improved their chances to get on the board. So that's kind of what it is. I'm relatively hands off with some of it, but not really. Any good executive director is going to be there and like saying, these are the criteria we really should be looking for. And this is the kind of thing that, that we want. But I don't really like, sort of conventional like board performance evaluations or self-evaluations. Those things are, not particularly helpful. Our board's got a lot of heart. They're there because they want to be. And, it's that sort of community driven spirit. We're also really concerned with representation. I would say the one place where we're a little bit more heavy handed is that in our internal criteria for who we're looking for, might really be not only geographically based, but also, we only had 3 women on our board. It's like, we need to recruit more women. We need more female voices on this board. In fact, when you look at the statistics in some of the communities that we're serving, some of the most underserved households are, predominantly female led. And then, we didn't have any females on our board that had any idea of what that experience might be like. So, trying to make sure that voices can be heard. And that's always an ongoing process is trying to think about who we can add. And you're never going to have the perfect board. But thinking about representation, I think, is really important. And making it just a little bit difficult for them to get on, because then that is going to, it's going to, they got to pay to play a little bit, with it's easy to write a check. It's not so easy to come to meetings and write an essay and try to compel people as to why you need to be on this board. So that the cream kind of rises to the top when you do it that way.
Zachary, early on you mentioned some of the projects you're working on in the city of Bay City, and there's one in particular which it's always kind of caught my attention because it's a challenge that a lot of communities face, which is what the state lovingly refers to as a conversion project. maybe if you wouldn't mind, share a little bit about what the circumstances were with Riverbend West in Bay City, and then how you worked with the city to overcome some of the challenges of state funding and rejection.
Sure. Yeah, the city of Bay City had about 25 years previously purchased a piece of property, an 8 acre parcel that is, you name it, it's wrong with this parcel. Like everything is wrong with it. It's got a power line easement running through the middle of it. It's a very odd shape. It's got a very unusual frontage. That was half of it was severed from the community by a railroad line. It's got an impacted shoreline. It's got, with all kinds of junk and debris and detritus on it. It had illegal dumping on it. It's just like one thing after another. It's like the last possible place you could think of being a conservation site. It was all fenced off because after they had bought it, they used Michigan Natural Resource Trust Fund dollars and said they were going to convert it to a new park, a waterfront park, and they never did. And so after a time, the DNR comes knocking saying, "Hey, how's it going with that project?" And they're like, "Well, we're not doing it right now." So they started penalizing the city 50 points on every trust fund application. And that penalty stood for a long time, like 10, 15 years. The city was incurring a 50-point penalty on every single trust fund application. And if somebody listening doesn't know, like, like a 400-point project is like, kind of a shoe in these days, or that's a good point project. You have a 350-point project, 300-point project under normal circumstances, that 50-point penalty, it kicks you to the curb. You're probably not going to make it. And so any project the city of Bay City was applying for anywhere in town had been impacted by this lack of performance on that site for all that time. But there's very few, open riverfront sites in the area that were, had any potential at all. And I can't remember the exact origin of where it was brought to my attention, other than just knowing about that site, the Dwan site, it used to be called. Um, I think the city parks director mentioned it to me and said, "Man, if we could do something about that." And I said, "Well, we probably could." So we started doing the homework. It ended up being about a $300,000 project. But, now we took it on. It's now called Riverbend West. It's not it's a great little site when you go there, but it's not like it's packed with amenities or anything. It's only 8 acres. We added a few thoughts to it. We basically gutted it of all the previously existing vegetation, which was all pioneer stuff and not too much good anyway. We took down probably 100 trees that were mostly dead trees along the waterfront, opened up the view shed there. And we put in a, kind of a quarter mile, maybe a third of a mile long pathway that's a pervious pavement. It's got a nice feel underfoot. It's very attractive looking. We put in some split rail fronts, some signage. We planted 30 or 40 different species of tree on there in this thing we call Turning Point Grove. So it's got a lot of trees there that don't traditionally grow in our area anymore, but really should, but they've been extirpated from the area. And then there's some other amenities, some boulders and benches and things like that. So it's a nice little nature experience. It's got a lot of solitude down the end of it. You walk down, a lot of people there's like wedding and engagement photos taken there a lot. It's a good like Instagram spot if you're in Bay City. If you point the one way, you can see downtown behind you, which is kind of nice. But when you go down to the end of the trail and you look down the river, you really only see trees and nature. So it's kind of a little it was a little diamond in the rough. But the thing is the city was excellent in that regard. They were anything they could do to help fuel us to get that work done, they did. And this was during the pandemic. It was right in the heart of the pandemic. So the project took about 2.5 years when it should have maybe taken less than two. But it was successful because now it's there. There's a crosswalk. It's attached to Defoe Park, which is a large, kind of conventional programmed city park. There's a skate park there and that. And it's a really neat little amenity. But on top of that, now when the city goes and applies for trust fund grants, they are in a much better position to be successful because that project is now meeting the intent of the original trust fund grant from all those years ago. So we've been able to work with the city to get their next very large trust fund grant. We came in. Let's see, Spicer and the SBLC, we worked together to help the city develop an application to the trust fund in this last round. I think out of 100 projects, I think we came in fourth for a $300,000 grant to do a project called Niagara Woods, which is another one in the city of Bay City. It's a 15-acre site with even a lot more potential than Riverbend West had. And that project to itself is actually serving to solve some final conversion issues with legacy trust fund issues that the city had. So, those are both interesting projects because they're actually both in neighborhoods that were sort of underserved by that kind of recreation and open space. So they met sort of our threshold for targeting a project like that in a neighborhood that needed it. Both of them do, Niagara Woods and Riverbend West. And they have that added benefit of solving those conversion issues and compliance issues that the city had with the trust fund, which has now allowed them to get additional trust fund grants to do more of that work. So it definitely was difficult. It definitely was worth doing, and it sat there for 25 years without us until we got involved. So it wouldn't have happened without us. And I think the city of Bay City, we're fast friends now because we've done a number of these projects with and for them, and we've become an extension of their staff in a lot of ways to make those things happen. So those projects are super close to our heart because we solved a lot of different problems and we sort of paved the way for more future success for the city down the road.
I'm curious at this point in your work, and this may be an unfair question, but if you had to share 3 things that inspire or motivate you the most right now, it could be a person or a relationship, it could be a community need or an opportunity, it could be a specific project or experience you're hoping to create, but what would maybe three things that are inspiring and motivating you right now be?
Well, the number one thing I always think about is that I want to, well, all right, we're in year 13 of my 3-year plan of being an executive director of a nonprofit right now. But I always thought that I wanted to build the SBLC into an organization that the community would never allow to fail. That was, you wanted to build it into something that the community cared about so much and valued enough that should tragedy strike, the community was not going to allow it to fail. And I think we're getting closer and closer to that, especially with people who really know, like agency partners and people, decision makers and that. I mean, they have stepped up. I mean, during the pandemic, we got as much, we grew during the pandemic. Resources came our way during the pandemic, which I think, some organizations did realize that because, we were kind of there and one of the few things that was, available to people when lockdowns happened, right? But giving went up and grants actually improved and we did pretty well during the pandemic. And so we grew a little bit faster during the pandemic than I would have liked, but it was to address community need. But the thing is, I'm always trying to think about, am I going to be leaving this organization better than I found it? But more than that, am I going to be leaving it, in a situation where it's so valued by the people that it serves that it could never be allowed to fail. So that's always in the back of my head, and we're getting closer and closer to that. But I don't think that work is ever finished. Um, Certainly, the people that I care about are going to be, first and foremost. I mean, like a lot of us. I mean, it's pretty easy. You mentioned that. I love outdoor activity and hiking and mountain biking and things like that. And we go to Colorado every year. We go out west a lot. We travel a lot for those things. But we have a lot of those things here at home. But we don't have mountains. We're not on Lake Michigan. There's some differences here, and there's some compromises that are to be made. I always want to try to drive our community closer and closer to that ideal that I can. I compare us a lot with Chattanooga, Tennessee. Chattanooga does have mountains around it, but it had a terribly polluted river. It had a huge industrial heritage. It had tons of disinvestment. It was a mess. And then you had some visionary leaders that said, we need to introduce the outdoor economy to this place because look around you, look at our climate, look at the trails, look at the mountains, look at the river. And now, I mean, it has been named, outside's outdoor community of the year, and it has had a tremendous amount of momentum up and down over the last, decade, 15 years. I see Bay City as a possibility, for that. Not just Bay City, but Bay City and Saginaw, the Saginaw River Valley. So trying to turn the community into a place that I want to live is a huge inspiration. It's like, nobody else is going to do it. It's pretty funny. You sit there and you think, I've literally had this thought before saying like, man, I wish we had more like natural surface trails in this town. I wish I could do more. I wish I could do more hiking in this town. And I thought about it and I'm just like, oh yeah, I'm literally the guy. Like I'm the guy that can do that. Like I'm the only guy that's going to do that probably. Like I'm the actual guy. Like it's, I was like, well, I can go to work tomorrow and tell people we're going to prioritize this and we're going to find new acres and we're going to build new trails and we're going to put those amenities in. And wouldn't you know it, a couple years later, we're able to do it. So, I mean, that's pretty awesome. Like who's got it better than me? It's like, when it comes to stuff like that. I've been able to carve out a good career and provide for my family and, live in an affordable community. And I've also been able to, if you're patient enough, which is one of my great faults that I'm not very patient, you can really kind of throw your back into actually turning the tide and making the community better. And that's like super rewarding. My wife is also the executive director of a nonprofit, the YWCA, the Great Lakes Bay Region, and their mission is, empowering women and eliminating racism. So, they're going to be working on that for a while, so, they're not going to be done anytime soon, and neither are we. But, she certainly envies the fact that we can identify a problem and solve it, or, see a metric and improve it. That's very inspiring to me. But good times and happy memories and that. And I would say the last thing is healthy communities. We have a community that is older, that has low educational attainment. Not just Bay City, and I'm talking primarily about the inner part of our watershed here, Bay City, Saginaw, Aranet County, up in the thumb and that. We have a community that doesn't have very good health markers. We have cancer clusters here. We're older as a community. There's a lot of things that are kind of facing where Bay City is not, and Saginaw is not. Some of these communities, they're not leading in the areas of public health. They're not leading in the areas of mental health. That's been a journey of mine, up and down and fought my own challenges and things along the way. And, trying to provide a community that provides the opportunity to live a healthy lifestyle, I think. And I'm not just talking about, going trail running or anything. I'm talking about fresh air and clean views and mental clarity and, positive vibes and just a community that feels like it's heading in the direction of prosperity. And our slice of the pie is just a slice of the pie. You have economic development, you've got, healthcare, schools, education, public safety, all the other things that happen. But it's important for me to make sure that, when my work is done here or the Land Conservancy is evolving into its next iteration, that slice of the pie for the work that we do remains constant and it's still there. And people recognize that that's an important part of, the renaissance of the community moving forward. So there's a lot of things that inspire me. I'm a pretty motivated guy. So it's fun to think about, what you can accomplish. And I don't know, every time I think about moving somewhere else, I think, well, what the heck, what am I going to, what am I going to do? Who's going to do this? So here we are.
Zachary, thank you. If folks want to learn more about the SBLC, where would you send them to?
You can go to saginawland.org is the easiest way. Primarily, we make very regular updates on social media, on Facebook primarily for longer form content, but also Instagram, or just give us a call. So it's pretty easy to find us. Saginawland.org takes you to our website. We're just in the process of updating all of that. So now there's project lists and descriptions on there. All of our nature preserves and things are on there, but there's also a contact us button. And you can get a hold of us very easily, and Sarah from our office will call you right back or email you right back and get you involved. We rely really heavily on volunteers, so I would encourage anybody in mid-Michigan that's interested in conservation and the environment to look us up and maybe raise their hand, because we'd love to have you out giving us a hand out on Habitat this spring.
Well, thanks everybody for checking in today and for listening. Whether you joined us during your commute or working out or just escaping reality, thanks for learning and reflecting with us. I think this has been a really powerful conversation today. Just a reminder that none of these stories would be possible without the dedication of people and organizations like the SBLC, who are working in their local communities to really change the feel and the quality of life there. Production provided by Anna Moya, thought leadership by Parallel Solutions, and of course, thanks to the CS Mott Foundation and the Conservation Fund for financial support of these sessions. Thanks again for hanging with us all today, and we will join you next time.